Welcome, everyone.
Hi, Jezreel. Hello,
Yeah, I was just
hello
wondering
everybody.
Hi. Okay, excellent. It looks as though we're all in. So you all know me, and but I'm not sure if you have introduced yourselves to each other formally, outside of this conference. So let's just start with a brief introduction. So shall we start with you, Tracy?
Oh, hi everybody. My name's Tracy Stanley. I'm calling to you from Brisbane, where I'm currently partway through a 54-hour tech startup-a-thon.
Okay, great. And David?
Good morning, David Adams, author, speaker, writer, coach, and delighted to join you.
Hey, David.
Brian?
Hi, morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, Brown Marcel. I run some companies in Eastern Europe on barcode and RFID solutions, and author as well.
Okay, excellent. And Khorshid?
Hi, I'm Khorshid. I'm currently sitting in my home in sunny London. Looking forward to this panel conversation. I'm a coach, a mentor. In previous career, I was in education. I'm still an educationist, and I have to say I do enjoy to talk about creativity.
Excellent. And Peter?
Hi, I'm Peter Griffiths. I'm also a coach. I'm actually based in Berlin, and I run a company called The Mind Takeaway, which is actually a coaching and consultancy company as well.
Okay. Okay, so, well, apart from David, all Tracy, Brian, Peter, and Khorshid, I did interviews with you at the last year's conference as well. So we've had quite, we share this deep interest in creativity, which has brought us all together. And David, I met for the first time this year. So the conversations that I've had with all of you over the years there's been some themes. Some of the themes have been about the challenges that we face when we're being creative. Some of the themes have been around, well, what is creativity? Does it have to be valuable? I know with Peter last year, we had discussions around this, like, does creativity need to be valuable, or is it just a creative expression? Peter is a musician, so we had conversations around creativity being, is it only to do with music and art, or is it much broader than that? And today I thought, maybe we can think about some of these challenges that we all face, challenges to do with time, challenges to do with lack of financial resources. Some people say that necessity is the mother of creativity, and that when we're going through times of adversity and austerity, that is when we're challenged to be very creative. So, what's your opinion on that? Have you found it easier to be creative in times of challenge, or do you find that you're more creative when you're relaxed and you don't have a lot of worries and concerns to be thinking about? So who would like to speak about that first?
I can say a few bits, if that's okay. I think constraints are quite useful in creativity. In terms of me being a musician in the past, when I had an overabundance of instruments, people to work with, an expensive studio, it didn't really always help. And actually, when I had no money and a few instruments around me, I did some of my best work, So what's all that about, I think that you can be creative in any situation, right? But I think constraints, even though at the time they can feel really uncomfortable, it can actually bring out some of your best work. Or that's what that's been my experience, at least, anyway.
Unless the constraint is time, I guess I would sort of add to what P was saying. I cannot be creative if I don't have enough time. I will stick with whatever worked the closest best last time, and choose that approach. So I just really think time for working on the idea and just time for reflection and thinking about other things.
But Tracy and everybody, time is everybody's issue. We have to use the time that is available, the same amount of time for everybody. Creative, in my view, it's about letting go rather than letting oneself be constrained. Amongst the other things that I do, I write poetry. And when I just let go, the poetry comes out.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more about being in a corporate life, you know, and if
Oh, yeah,
creativity
sure.
in the workplace was required. Sometimes you've got so many other things to do that you have to, you know, if you don't have a choice to delegate, then, and you have to do everything, then you do things as quickly as you can, and often that doesn't give time for the creative processes.
No, I can, sorry, go on there as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say that David is a poet, and I was wondering, David, do you, you know, the poetry that you write, and you say that everyone's got the same amount of time, do you, your best poetry, you know, like looking back, when has that poetry emerged? Has it been at times when you were busy doing other things, or did you have, you know, were you on holiday and just totally relaxed without anything else to think about?
What I say, and Brian knows this, I've told people, I bought Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Work Week, some years ago, but I haven't had time to read it yet. The older you get, the less time you've got. Each day is a smaller part of your life. And you've just got to use it. You've got to have a process, which doesn't sound very creative, but you create a process to use the time most efficiently. And yes,
your poetry though, David, what about your poetry? When have you, you know, like looking back at the poetry?
The best poetry.
When, right.
I'll have to write a poem about that.
When you have the time.
No, it's not. It's about not hanging on to concepts.
Yes.
About letting go. And the Buddha said, the first step on the road to freedom is letting go.
It's difficult though. It's easier as you get older and you have less demands on your time, but much more difficult when you're younger, just starting off, and there are so many different things, especially in this fast-paced world, that people need to pay attention to. But I also think that even with the constraints of time, if you have the right-minded people with you, you can come up with creative solutions pretty quickly. It's just putting together the right heads who can think out of the box, but who can also challenge the novel as much as they can challenge the norm, that creative solutions can emerge.
Mm.
I find that I need to get out of the office space to be creative. So when I'm on a plane or in the car, I do my best thinking because there are no phones or any interruptions. And if I've got a particular problem I need to solve, I'll just keep thinking about it as I walk around the streets or if I'm cycling or whatever. But if there's a collective problem to solve, then I'll get a group of people together and we could do a brainstorming session and try and come out with something.
Last year, Brian, we talked about visions, and you know, being in your position as a leader of an organization, you have to have the vision. And you know, so some people think that we need to have collaboration when we're creating a vision. For you, you know, what has been most useful, the individual time that you spent on creating this vision for your company, or the collaborative time that you've spent with your team?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because at the moment I'm trying to get a new vision, new business model going, and it's actually quite involved. So initially I got a consultant to come along, come up with some ideas, and I went to America to have a 2-day workshop. Then I realized it was going to be quite difficult to implement, and I'd have to do the implementation. So I spent a lot of time, as I say, thinking on the planes and in cars and stuff, how to implement it. So I then decided to get a steering group together of people who were committed to the model. And we had our first meeting this week, as a matter of fact. And so a lot of very useful stuff's come out of that and a way forward. So obviously I can't do it on my own, but at least I can get the vision and direction going, thinking on my own, and then bring it to a steering group to kind of come up with a way forward.
Anybody else? Any thoughts on this vision? You know, do you think that it's easier to co-create a vision, or do you think, like, you know, you need to have time and space to create your own vision and then get people to persuade others to buy into it?
I think there's an element of both. If you look at many of the inventions and discoveries, they start with what can be called the lone genius, but very often they've actually come into fruition through group genius, because it's not always easy for one person to take forward their idea without the collective thinking of others to even test the idea to see if it's at all feasible. So I think you need a bit of both. So Steve Jobs is an example. He had a brilliant idea, but he needed a team of people to help to bring it to the world.
I would second that. I love doing things in isolation and coming up with new ideas, but I also have a close circle of people that can bounce ideas off and then refine, and get feedback and then go back sometimes to the drawing board, or start again from scratch. So it's always useful to have people around you, I guess.
I was just going to say that Steve Jobs, as Khorshid was talking about Steve Jobs, he's also an example of someone who had a vision that, there was a point when he was expelled from his own company because he brought the wrong people in that had a very different vision to he did. So sometimes our own visions can be totally destroyed because others have a more powerful vision, perhaps.
That is absolutely true, and that's why you have to get the right people around you who will share your vision, and then of course you've got to be have the kind of leadership which will help persuade them, and you can do that through communicating with them. But going back to what Peter said, is going back to the drawing board as well sometimes, because with the people around you, you realize that that vision possibly cannot be achieved.
Okay. Any other comments on that?
As well as having,
go ahead, David.
sorry. As well as having like-minded people around you, it's also useful to have people who think in the opposite direction.
True.
So that brings out your creativity and the group's creativity.
That's right. It's very easy to be around others who simply agree with us, and there's a lot of comfort in that. But with creativity, there needs to be discomfort. There needs to be this tension.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments?
I think by like-minded people, I actually meant other creatives. So people who have a creative bent mind, so to speak.
And I think it's good to have people you can trust that can be honest with you, because I can be my own worst enemy if I really want to drive an idea forward. And sometimes I don't have that clarity. So it's good to have people who will step up and say, look, I know you really want to run with this and it's lighting you up, but I don't think it's going to work. Have you considered X, Y, Z? I think that's really useful as a sanity check.
Yeah, I agree with Peter. I think intention, people who really want to help and who are prepared to play a different role and to comment, you get a lot of value from that. But of course, if they want to be mischievous, then that's not so helpful. But
I think it's important to have some proper tools for brainstorming as well, because that sends you through a process, and it tends to get those people who don't want to come up with any ideas because they're shy or whatever, you can draw them out, because it's important to create an atmosphere where no idea is stupid and nobody sort of puts anybody down. Because that would just stop people from contributing.
And sometimes an idea which sounds a bit silly at that time or irrelevant, but maybe later on in a few weeks' time or the following year, it might be a very, very good idea. It's just that it wasn't the right time and place for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's also good to be able to document that, because I've had many ideas that haven't beared fruit for years. And actually, if I hadn't documented it, I had the right kind of people around me to say, look, you tried that a few years back, and maybe it's the right time for that to, see the light of day.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of time and finances, some people begin their creative journey when they've retired. You know, they've finished paying off their mortgage and they feel that they have the right time and space. A lot of us, you know, Khorshid, yourself and myself, we've been teachers for a very long time, and you know that when we're in the full flow of a teaching career, there doesn't seem to be enough time to be thinking about innovation because we're so busy doing what we need to do. So do you think that, Khorshid, I know that you've kind of left the education world for a while now. Do you find that you've been more creative outside of the organization as you were within it?
Not particularly, no, because I've always been very creative in my teaching itself. So it's become a habit, so to speak. The only difference is what I miss now is to have that collective creativity, because as a consultant, I'm working on my own. And so I have only myself to be creative with. But what I try to do is with the clients that I work with, I try to draw out their creativity so that together we can, you know, move along the journey that they wish to take. Time has never been such a big issue for me because, as I said, I think we can be creative even with less time. Is just in what the value creation is going to be. Are we creative and creating value? Are we being creative just for the sake of being creative? Or is there a need to be creative if, as Tracy said earlier, something is available that can be used in a particular situation? But time-wise, as I mentioned earlier, being retired, I have all the time in the world to be as creative as I want. But creativity has to have an end result. So I miss that. I miss that working environment where that could happen much more easily.
Tracy, how do you feel about this? Because you, you know, you've written a book, and when you were writing that book, were you also part of an organization, or were you working totally for yourself at that time?
Sorry, Jessica, who are you addressing that question to? There's a few authors on the panel.
Because I know you spent time writing your book, and I was wondering if you wrote the book when you were totally working freelance, or were you part of an organization when you wrote?
I was generally on my own, and it was interesting. It was the first time I'd co-authored, and Barbara Wilson and I had many different views on things, and it was interesting. You know, Barbara's a creativity coach as well, and that tension was really good for the book because we had to debate things, and there were some things we didn't resolve, and we actually described our disagreements in the book because, you know, we think that's part of the creative process, to talk about the things you don't agree with. Not everything is clear. Ambiguity is part of the creative process. So that's one thing that I learned. It was hard, but we laughed about it, and neither of us gave in, but we just, you know, use that creative tension to demonstrate what happens when you get people with different points of view together.
Excellent. And Brian, you also have written a book, and, you know, so how was that process for you? Did you create the time and space for it, you know, out of your organizational work, or, you know, did you collaborate with others when you were writing?
Well, my problem was that I knew I'd never get it written unless I had some kind of process or someone kicking me up the proverbial, because the book had actually been sort of, because my life story in the barcode industry, memoirs basically, although I turned it into a business book. But that's been on the cards for about 10 years, and I didn't think I could remember anything to start with. Therefore, there wouldn't be much subject matter. But I found this very nice lady in America who had a process over sort of 3 modules of 14 lessons. So I think over a couple of years, she came up with this really good process to write, which of course included weekly deadlines of various and then I was away, and she edited it and published it. So I was very fortunate. Without her, it would never ever have got written, to be honest.
Yeah. Tracy, can you resonate with that?
Absolutely, yeah. It's good to have a process. I'd like to know more about your process apart from the weekly catch-ups. What else she did? It'd be interesting to learn.
Well, she's called the Book Professor. So
Okay.
look on her website.
I will.
Nancy Erickson.
Okay.
Yeah, she's really good. She taught. She's only in non-fiction, by the way. I presume everybody's into non-fiction. But yes, she's non-fiction, and she, you know, you've got to get a purpose for the book, and that's what really resonates all the way through. She throws away everything that doesn't meet this purpose that you started with, which is quite good, actually. She got rid of 40,000 words I wrote.
Oh, goodness.
So,
Heartbreaking.
quite tough. So in fact, I think she's thrown away a whole new book. I should really get together all the 40,000 words and turn it into another book with another purpose.
Brian, that you talk about this being non-fiction, because I think the process is very different when you're writing a fictional piece of work compared with non-fiction. So what I've noticed is that a lot of the fictional writers, they don't like deadlines, they don't like the constraints, because that inspiration comes from within rather than an external someone setting you deadlines. But for non-fiction work, I can see that would work a lot better.
Both are hard. I mean, I write fiction as well as non-fiction. Whenever I'm writing fiction, I think, oh, this is too hard, I should write non-fiction. So I swap over to the other book. Like, oh, I'll flip, this is hard. It's much easier in the pretend world of fiction. And so I bounce back again.
Well, I think fiction...
There is a parallel. Sorry.
Go ahead.
God, David.
No, there is a parallel. I help business people to be creative, to think with the whole brain by a process I call unlocking creativity. And one of the catalysts is poetry.
Yeah.
For people who have not written anything since school days and were taught that it was all rigid and parallel and so on. But again, by letting go, you can create in your mind huge streams of ideas, and that helps people unlock themselves. And in teams and on company boards, they learn more about each other and about their team than they've ever done. So it creates a huge level of a greater level of trust. And when you have trust in a team or a board, you get more done.
Going back to the imaginative world we all first started our lives in, isn't it? There were no constraints or restraints on your imagination as a child.
Yes.
Yeah. But then the education system takes over, doesn't it?
Leaches it out.
Well, then it goes back to that point about privilege. You know, nowadays, if you go to a very expensive private school, your children might learn a lot more poetry than they would going to a state-funded school. So, you know, in the past, like poetry and art, they were related to the elite could afford to engage in, you know, deep poetry, deep art and whatever, and that made them more creative. Whereas if you had like just to work in a factory, 50 hours a week, then you didn't really have that luxury and that privilege to engage in poetry unless you made a special effort to do so.
Because the irony is a lot of poetry has rigid format. So you've got a sonnet with 40 lines. You've got a haiku with 17 syllables. It's quite ironic to look at all this, the numbers that come into poetry. The poetry that I write have no form whatsoever. And for me, I don't know for everybody else, but for me, that gives me a more creative outlook.
I agree.
All right, so just to round off, so we were talking about, you know, the limitations, final comments on this, Peter?
Well, I've been given a year to complete an album, for instance, and it didn't bode well for me because I didn't really have the constraints. And then on the flip side, I've had very limited time, but in those short bursts, I was kind of clear as to what I needed to do. And I think it's a human invention, time. So we spend a lot of times up in our heads thinking about time than we do actually taking action, or at least that's been my experience for, you know, coaching creatives, because the narrative is they're always telling themselves a story.
It's all about discipline, isn't it? I mean, everybody comes up with excuses not to do things. And one of the most important excuses, I haven't got time. Because you can get away with that because you can identify with everybody else who thinks that's the same problem. So I think you have to overcome that and just say, well, I'll make time. And you can always make time because you may work 16 hours a day, but you've still got 8 hours, which I'm not suggesting you stay awake for 8 hours, but during those 16 hours, you've probably got 8 hours where, you know,
well, dreams, you know, even when we're asleep, a lot of creativity emerges from dreams anyway. So, Tracy, any final comments?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a couple of points. Certainly, I go to bed with a thought, and even when I'm not in my unconscious, my brain is still working, and often I get tremendous clarity when I first wake up, even though I'm not aware of the dream. And I was also just thinking, I don't know how to weave this in. I know myself, I'm a bit of an overthinker. Like I'll keep thinking and thinking and thinking and trying to get and try to make a decision based on perfect information. And it's interesting. So I said I'm on this this hackathon, and because I just don't think that I've done anything properly.
Okay, and David.
There are so many thoughts coming in as a result of this conversation, but the one I could perhaps end with is the fact that with coaching clients, I often say, if you had an extra day, what would you do with it? And it's quite interesting to hear what people come up with and how they could actually reorganize themselves to use that extra time.
Great. And Khorshid, final points.
Well, I just want to echo what everyone, or as Peter said, in those short bursts, you can come out with the best that you can offer creatively. So I think, as we all agree, we do make an excuse of time just to procrastinate or not to do something, whereas we can make creative use of time.